Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We are resuming our panels. Our next panel is Prosecuting War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, Moving Beyond the UN. And our moderator will be Matej Raska. We also have a video that will be played by Alexandra Matvichuk, who unfortunately at the last minute wasn't available, but she has recorded something for us. Thank you.
It's a huge honor for me to address to this distinguished audience. I'm a Ukrainian human rights lawyer, and I have been applying the law to defend people and human dignity for many years. Now I'm in a situation when the law doesn't work. Russian troops are destroying residential buildings, schools, churches, museums, and hospitals. They're shooting at the evacuation corridors. They're torturing people in filtration camps. They're forcibly taking Ukrainian children to Russia. They ban Ukrainian language and culture. They are abducting, robbing, raping, and killing in the occupied territories. And the entire UN system of peace and security cannot stop it. I have one question. How we, people in 21st century, will defend the human beings, their lives, their freedom, and their dignity? Can we rely on the law, or does just brutal force matter? It's important to know this not only for people in Ukraine and Syria. The answer to this question defines our common future. All this hell which people in Ukraine and people in Syria are faced, it's a result of total impunity which autocrats enjoyed for decades. They have never been punished. They believe they can do whatever they want. We must break the circle of impunity. We must unite our efforts and demonstrate justice. There were so many failures in the world. We have to find a way and to get success.
Right, hello. And now I'm going to ask each panelist, including Ariana Jik, who is online, to introduce themselves and their expertise and briefly state their main approach to the subject, which is, again, prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity beyond the UN, because it's already been established that the UN doesn't quite work anymore. So, Ariana.
Oh, hello. Sorry, I wasn't aware that I was already on. Hi, thank you very much for having me. It's nice to meet you. My name is Ariana Gic. I am the director of Direct Initiative, International Center for Ukraine. I focus on legal and political analysis. For a number of years, I have been working on various I would call them ambitious political agendas to fight Russian aggression, warning for years about Russia's ambitions of overturning the world order, and to recognize Russia as an aggressor state responsible for interstate war in Ukraine from 2014, advocating to have Russia recognized as a rogue state, designated Wagner as a terrorist organization, and advocating for robust military and legal response to Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Thank you. Andrei?
Thank you. My name is Andrei Mikheyev, and I am an international lawyer for the International Center for Ukrainian Victory, the Ukrainian civic platform aimed in promotion of the Ukraine's interests on the international level, promotion of Ukrainian victory, and lobbying the support of Ukrainian armed forces, support of Ukrainian civic society, and Ukraine reconstruction after the consequences of the Russian aggressive war. I'm very honored to be here, as there are obviously a lot of common issue, a lot of parallels between the devastating crimes committed by Russians, both in Syria and Ukraine, against the civil population, and especially against vulnerable parts of civil population, such as children, women, and aged population. We especially focused on the expertise of the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed, on the problems of their investigation, problems related to the collection of evidence and exchange of evidence between Ukraine and other countries and other international members. And I think it's very important to conduct such events between representatives of states which suffered like experience, to exchange some experience and to elaborate some common approaches in promotion and in publication of such cases for the international community, to make everyone know exactly with facts, with figures, and with particular examples what's happening when Russian armed forces are coming to foreign countries and starting to pursue their military interests. Thank you.
Farzaneh?
Yes. My name is Farzaneh Hosseini. I am a lawyer and human rights activist from Iran, obviously living in exile. I'm based in the UK. I'm here really because I think there is a common denominator really in all of this in terms of the Russia's aggression and war against Ukraine and the crimes that have been and are being committed in Syria, in that Iran has played an active role in both conflicts in supporting the regime of Bashar al-Assad as well as Putin, in terms of supporting them with funding, with military equipment, etc. And I think, as personally, as an Iranian and as a supporter of the Iranian opposition in exile, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, it's important for me to be here to voice our support, the Iranian people's support for Ukraine and for the people of Syria as well, and show that we stand very much with them and against the regime of Iran, which unfortunately represents us on the international stage. In terms of my association with the National Council of Resistance of Iran, I've been involved in various campaigns to bring about accountability and justice for crimes committed by the Iranian regime, both at home in terms of human rights abuses, as well as internationally, in respect of the funding and acts of terrorism across the Middle East, its support currently for Hamas in Gaza, and its provision of Shahed drones and missiles here in Ukraine. So, I mean, the list is ongoing. So we're fighting human rights abuses at home, its support for terrorism internationally, crimes against humanity committed, again, within Iran, assassination of foreign dissidents across Europe, on lots of fronts. So I think I'll get into that a bit more later.
And we have another guest online, Ibrahim Olabi.
Yes, hi, good afternoon again. My name is Ibrahim Olabi. I am the Chief Legal Counsel for the Reckoning project, which is a Ukrainian organization working on Ukraine when it comes to the kind of human testimony elements that form around accountability in the fight against impunity. But I'm also working extensively on Syria. I am British Syrian. I'm a British Syrian lawyer in the UK and have been for the last 10 years and still am working on the Syrian conflict. So half of my week is on Ukraine and the other half is on Syria. So in a way, the kind of background that I would hope to bring to the discussion is both being as a British Syrian lawyer who's engaged with war crimes unit in different parts of the world, including here in the UK, and also part of the kind of advocacy and lobby groups in a lot of those countries where cases have been set up to kind of discuss the policy elements of advocacy and lobbying on domestic issues that can lead to kind of cases in that sense. And then doing the link with Ukraine, where kind of my focus as the chief legal counsel for the Reckoning Project is really to turn the human elements and the testimonies that our team in Ukraine have collected and documented to explore legal avenues that can be explored and used and utilized to pursue accountability, whether it's prosecutions or beyond, so both court-based accountability and beyond that.
Thank you. Stephen?
Well, I've spoken twice already. I'll be very brief, but just to state, what the reason is for my engagement and who I represent. Obviously, as I mentioned, I've been an international prosecutor for Rwanda and Sierra Leone, and then was for 6 years ambassador at large for President Obama from 2009 to 2015. For what we call war crimes issues. We changed the name of the office to Global Criminal Justice. Office is still in the State Department, headed by my former deputy, Beth Van Skok, who's providing assistance to programs like Yevgeny's, who we'll hear about in a little bit. And I continue to engage with that office and its efforts. But my primary sponsor is the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and its Center for the Prevention of Genocide that has that paid me a small sum each year as a stipend to continue to work globally on the mission of prevention of genocide through accountability. And that enables me to participate in some 12 different organizations as a board member or board chair, each of them focused to a large extent on one, gathering the evidence, the strongest evidence, so that when there is a way into court, that there will be strong cases against the most responsible perpetrators. And that, as we know, is often a challenge. We know the crimes happen, but proving that somebody did it and finding a way to bring them to court is the biggest challenge. But you have to have that proof. And sometimes the better the proof, the better argument you have for getting a court interested in the case. And then, of course, they're finding the avenues to justice. And that means working in states to strengthen their laws, to establish the sort of specialized units that will allow the prosecution of these cases, and finding sort of legal theories and tools that will enable these cases to be pursued and for appropriate convictions, if the evidence is there, to be entered and for people to be punished and reparations to be paid, et cetera. But that whole process we're all working on, and I sometimes think I'm like an operator in the old days, who was sort of plugging in the connections and trying to make sure that people are connected to the resources, to the partners that will enable justice to be done, despite all of the challenging problems and inadequacies and headwinds that we see in the international system.
Yevgeny?
Hi, my name is Yevgeny Vimin. I am an American born in Ukraine. I recently retired from a 25-year career in the Army. I was a colonel. Half of my career was in the infantry, airborne, and the other half was as a lawyer, judge advocate. So I've been a prosecutor. I've been an advisor to commanders conducting operations in Iraq. I've been an advisor on the National Security Council in the White House and on matters related to international organizations, war crimes, the ICC, genocide. And after retiring about a year ago, I signed on with a program called the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, as the ambassador mentioned. The program is actually a direct response to the ineffectiveness of international institutions like the UN. So we're filling a role really with a coalition of partners, the EU, UK, and the US, and others that are soon to sign on, working directly with the Prosecutor General's office here, and prosecutors regionally, helping them investigate, advising on the law of war, international criminal law, lex specialis, areas where very experienced prosecutors here in Ukraine may have conducted cases on murders and sexual assaults, but not necessarily attacks on infrastructure or events that involve military forces. And I run a portion of the program. I'm the director of the Military Analysis and Prosecution Support Cell, advising the Interinstitutional Working Group, which sounds like a very boring bureaucratic organization, but it's really quite interesting and innovative. The Prosecutor General, the predecessor to the current Prosecutor General, created this organization, and it's been continued. It's basically a committee of military experts, so former general, military officers that understand military operations, order of battle, chain of command, weapon systems, release authorities, prosecutors, investigators from the National Police, the SBU, intelligence services that are gathering information that will eventually be used in war crimes cases, creating the linkage or conducting the linkage analysis between disparate acts or disparate attacks on infrastructure in different areas and synthesizing a picture, ultimately to be able to hold the senior leadership accountable, whether it's military senior leadership, the general staff, or the civilian senior leadership for war crimes, command responsibility cases. And this is my 14th trip since June of last year. I spent quite a bit of time here. I've visited 6 regional offices, I've been all across the country, spent a lot of time on the road, and I've gotten a pretty good sense of what the situation looks like, and happy to talk about it during next questions.
Thank you. And now the first question, and I'm going to start with Ariana again. Is it possible to replicate the prosecutions that we saw in Germany of Syrian war criminals in the case of war crimes committed in Ukraine? Ariana. Are you there?
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm having a few technical difficulties on my end. My apologies. My position is that there should be an international response to the question of Russia's accountability. We don't need to wait until the end of the war to prosecute Russian war criminals. There's a legal maxim that it's a basic legal maxim every law student is taught in law school. Justice delayed is justice denied. And yet somehow we tend to forget about this very simple but powerful idea. Since February 2014, the start of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, Russian political and military leadership, as well as ordinary Russians in uniforms and without them, have committed tens of thousands of crimes in Ukraine. And now for nearly 10 years, Russians have acted with almost total impunity. One of the reasons Russians continue committing their heinous crimes in Ukraine today, 2023, almost a full 10 years later, is because the international community has done close to nothing to bring them to accountability. From the very onset of Russian aggression in 2014, the main legal front line to repress Moscow's attack had to be the unequivocal international recognition of the illegality of Russia's aggression and the consequent prosecution of the Russian leadership. At Nuremberg, the court made the most brilliant statement that initiating the war of aggression is the supreme international crime which contains within itself the accumulated evil of all war crimes that follow from the war. If we had seen an international effort to bring Putin to justice for Russia's war of aggression in 2014, it would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, which have been taken since the war then, and prevented immeasurable destruction to Ukraine. Instead of indictment for aggression against Ukraine, Putin was rewarded, though, with the Minsk Accords, where he could play the role of mediator in his own war. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline contract, a Russian energy weapon, and new Western investments in the Russian economy to finance Moscow's aggression further. This compromised Western policy paved the way for Russian genocide against Ukraine and war crimes and crimes against humanity on an industrial scale. I've published countless articles criticizing irresponsible Western policy towards Russian aggression. Western leadership refused to acknowledge the observable reality of Russia's undeclared war against Ukraine. It didn't see Russian special operations units and Wagner mercenaries in Crimea. It didn't see the Russian regular army in Donbass. It didn't see Russian concentration camps for Ukrainians in occupied Ukraine. It didn't want to see the evolving genocide of Ukrainians in the Russian occupied territories, deliberate attacks on civilians and infrastructure, torture, the use of civilians as human shields, sexual violence, or kidnapping of Ukrainian children, all well before 2022. Moscow pulled all kinds of tricks from its hat to shield itself from the responsibility for the crime of aggression. The Kremlin claimed that it is conducting a humanitarian mission to rescue Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine from attacks by Ukrainian Nazis. The absence of any facts to support its claims never stood in the way of its propaganda. Moscow used Ukraine's former runaway president Viktor Yanukovych to justify its invasion as the restoration of constitutional order. Moscow claimed that some mythical people of Crimea and then of Luhansk and Donetsk had a right of self-determination. And all those claims were part of a calculated legal warfare against Ukraine, supported and amplified by a global propaganda campaign. Russia even claimed that its 2022 large-scale offensive on Ukraine was an exercise of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter to preempt Ukraine's military attack and Ukraine from joining NATO, a defensive bloc. Unfortunately, the West, Western media in particular, played its shameful part in legitimizing Russian propaganda narratives. And for 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, the world was forced to live in a big political and media lie of Russia-backed separatist rebellion in Ukraine, designed to save face for Western political leaders and to justify their refusal to confront Russia.
Right.
In 2022, the devastating scale of Russian barbarity made it impossible for the West to continue ignoring the morbid reality of Moscow's aggressive regime. It's not just Ukrainians, but citizens of the whole world who were failed by the cowardly refusal to face Russia. And Moscow didn't attack Ukraine only. In 2014, it attacked the international security order, and we all live in a much more dangerous world as a result. And this is why it remains critical that the international community finally establishes a proper legal forum for Russia's accountability for its crime of aggression.
I'm into that, yeah. Thank you. But to bring it back to the question, there were prosecutions in Germany of Syrian war criminals that were successful. And the question was, Andrei, can we replicate that? Can it be replicated on criminals that conducted war crimes here in Ukraine?
I would like to specify, can we open criminal investigations in foreign countries other than Ukraine, national criminal investigations? Yeah. Yeah, sure. The majority of national criminal legislations of the of the European countries have the extraterritorial jurisdiction on crimes, especially on war crimes and crime of aggression. And there is no obstacle, there is no barrier in opening criminal investigation in any European country, neither in the US or Canada. And currently there are a lot of, there are some investigations already opened there, and evidence is being collected by the prosecutorial offices and by the police departments of different countries. The problem now is not in opening and pursuing such investigations. The problem is more in exchange of such evidence. And currently, as the specified international center has been established and managed by the Eurojust organization, they are implementing the electronic system on collection and exchange of evidence, which are collected and brought by the national authorities, and may be then transferred to Ukraine, for instance, after the request through the international legal assistance mechanism. Thank you.
Thanks. Ibrahim, you're an expert in UK law. What's preventing the UK from bringing these sorts of prosecutions in London?
Sure. Well, first of all, actually, quite interestingly, when you land, I don't know if any of you landed in the UK. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Any of you who came to London recently, when you land, you'll find a big banner saying, if you have witnessed crimes in Ukraine, please scan this QR code or get in touch with the Metropolitan Police, which is a good kind of initiative for them to kind of collect data. I guess that there are multiple challenges with these things. I mean, from a policy perspective, the UK doesn't often, and in some cases is prevented actually from opening cases where there is no perpetrator or there is no prospect of getting the perpetrator or at least a prospect of arrest in that sense. In many cases that I've kind of been involved in this process, that we get across this policy hurdle because, to answer your question, like, in Germany and other cases when it came to Syria, there was a perpetrator present. Now, this is not always the case because in France, for example, there are arrest warrants against perpetrators, or there are cases going in absentia against certain perpetrators of Syrian that are linked to crimes in Syria. But the incentive structure of home offices and justice departments is not geared for international justice. What they, their funding, their budgets, their metrics of success, if you like, is, how many investigations did I open versus how many investigations did I close? So the strategic relevance of issuing an arrest warrant that then does not lead to the arrest of the person is not seen as necessarily a success metric in the eyes of the domestic systems, right? Because it takes money, it takes taxpayer money in that sense. Internationally, getting an arrest warrant out, regardless of whether you get the arrest or not, is very important for the narrative. But many domestic police kind of success metrics are not designed that way. And that's a huge constraint on their ability to be proactive and their ability to go and investigate things where the prospect of arrest is low or zero. So it's more of a policy consideration than a legal consideration. Obviously, there are other legal considerations linked to it. That doesn't mean that in the time being that there are structural investigations going on. There's the collection of data. There's the sharing of data, as Andre mentioned. And these are all very big challenges, but it is happening. But at least the will is there, even if the policy and there are some legal issues that are challenging.
Thank you. Stephen?
Ibrahim has said a lot of it, but I think the reality is that most countries don't have the resources to do this, and only certain ones have prioritized it at a high level. And that's the experience we've had with the Syria file. The Germans have a universal jurisdiction statute that allows them to prosecute a case if it's in German interest. They don't have to have the perpetrator present. They don't have to have a citizen who is a victim. They can take on cases, as they did the Syrian detention case, and issue arrest warrants, as they did for Jamil Hassan, the head of Air Force Intelligence that's responsible for the horrible detention facility, Jawiya, at El Meza military air base, et cetera, not far from the presidential mansion in Damascus. And they were able to get out an arrest warrant on that basis, even though, of course, he's still in Syria, though sometimes he goes into Lebanon and for medical care, but no one has been able to bring him to custody. On the other hand, they are much more inclined, as most countries are, to prosecute people that are present in their country, where they can arrest that individual and bring them to trial. And many countries, in part, it's the attitude about immigrants. We don't want to let criminals in here. We don't want to be a safe haven. And of course, victims realize that. If among them there's a perpetrator, they want to see that person prosecuted. So countries have put some priority into those sort of present in kind of cases. Germany the most, and that enabled them to build, because they had a structural investigation, not just to react to one actor here, one actor there, but to build up a full investigation and then to pursue the Roslin case, not just because he was one guy who tortured 58 people to death, but because he did it as part of a crime against humanity, of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. They've got the best law. Sweden has a similar law, and they could do cases universally, but they only generally focus on those cases that are present in country, like they did in the Iranian case that I talked about earlier this morning. like they've done in Rwandan cases, like they're doing with the Lundin Petroleum case, because those are their own citizens that were involved in these crimes in South Sudan. So that's the kind of case, but they do have this potential to deal with things universally, and so they're open to these. Then you have France, which doesn't have universal jurisdiction, but is quite aggressive about using the sort of crimes against its own citizens. And that's how they got out their arrest warrant for Ali Mamlouk and Jamil Hassan and his deputy. And now they're going to proceed with an in absentia trial against those 3 individuals, which is permitted in France, but not in most other countries. Those are the major ones. Britain has only tried 2 people that we know of on universal jurisdiction basis. One of them from Afghanistan, as we heard this morning, was convicted. There was one from Nepal that was acquitted. And because of the complexity of their system and the need to have juries and the difficulty of bringing witnesses in, they really don't act very much in this area. Other countries are getting into the act to a greater extent. In the US, we do a fair number of these things, but usually it's because the person lies on immigration papers. We don't have primary jurisdiction over the crime, though that's changing. The question now is, can these things, same things be done for Ukraine? Is it significant at all? Well, I do think there's a greater interest now in focusing on Ukrainian cases. Of course, we don't have a lot of Russian perpetrators necessarily running around in Sweden yet. There will be some. There will be some people traveling. There'll be some people traveling to third countries where maybe through pressure you can get an extradition. And so there needs to be a focused effort to do this. Now, we have a joint investigative team, which includes Ukraine, includes the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, includes Poland, includes Slovakia and Romania, and the ICC, and now the US is an associate member. And so they're looking at a more coordinated approach to focus on particularly Russian war criminals that they can somehow get their hands on and prosecute in one of those countries. So those are the opportunities that are out there. There are, I should note, I was talking to someone last night who was deeply involved in the passive personality cases. There have been a number of victims in Ukraine of crimes. Like there was an American who was killed by an anti-personnel weapon in a food line in Chernihiv early in the conflict. That gives the US jurisdiction to prosecute the perpetrator. There are others in Canada. There are at least 3 in Germany, et cetera. So we'll soon see some of these cases where these countries will enter arrest warrants for people present in Russia. And they may become public, they may not be. They may be waiting to see if they can catch this person when they travel to Turkey or someplace else. And so we'll begin to see those actions as well. It won't be a big thing, to be frank, compared to what's happening in Ukraine. But it is part of justice, and countries are willing to do it. I don't want to go on too long, but I should note that there's also sanctions and violation of sanctions, people that engaged with arms dealers, people that engaged with support of the regime. Those are those sometimes provide enormous potentials for prosecuting corporations. We had a case in the United States against the French bank BNP Paribas where we got a $9 billion fine against the bank for breaking sanctions. So we should be looking for those cases which we can recover assets on and get those back to Ukraine.
Evgeny, one second.
So, I mean, the ambassador covered a lot of ground there, and frankly, other than adding that these cases are being looked at in the United States, there are several that have been identified. I won't get into the specifics. There are many more pending. I think these cases are coming. But we're really talking about a handful. The biggest difference, though, in having other countries try these cases in Syria, in the Syria context, and here, is that Syria was the perpetrator. Right? These cases were not going to be tried in domestic jurisdiction. In Ukraine, many of these cases, the Ukrainians have 90,000 cases that are open. I don't think we're going to see 90,000 prosecutions, but we're going to see every oblast, every region prosecuting cases. We're going to see cases prosecuted in domestic jurisdiction in Kyiv. That is where the lion's share of the cases will be tried. Some of them will be tried in areas where there is jurisdiction or some sort of jurisdictional hook, like the United States, Canada, Germany. There'll be some cases tried in ICC, again, a small handful. Some cases, if there is ever eventually an international tribunal for the crime of aggression, but the vast majority of cases will be tried in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are currently tried in these cases. There have been, I think, my information may be a little bit old, but over 50 trials, a number of convictions secured. some of those in absentia, some of them with POWs that are currently serving time. So I think while the universal jurisdiction or some sort of extraterritorial jurisdiction is important in the Syria context, it's not quite as important in the Ukrainian context, other than really honing in on the fact that this is a major issue. And I think the biggest value will come in linking the Ukrainian domestic system, the arrest warrants, the convictions, into an international system. So when the suspects or convicted criminals travel abroad, they can be detained, they can be arrested, they can be returned to Ukraine to face justice.
Thank you. And before the next question, Andrei wants to add something.
Yeah, I wanted to react somehow. I totally agree with the arguments that the criminal investigation authorities of foreign countries other than Ukraine, they have some political and practical arguments. And really, if the perpetrator is not in of war crimes or crimes against humanity is not in such a country, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to pursue the investigation. However, if Ukrainian refugees who suffered from such crimes, they then manage to survive and cross the Ukrainian border and come to such a country, and they address police or a prosecutor office, such authorities obliged to open such investigations. However, the usefulness of such investigations would only be obvious in case the subject of a crime has some money, has some assets located in such a country. For example, some money on the bank account. In that case, there can be made some preliminary temporary ruling to block and freeze such assets, which then may be used after the final sentence to compensate the victims for the damages suffered. In other case, that's actually, and I do really agree, would be useful to put the best efforts to the mechanisms of transferring such proceedings to Ukraine. It would be more useful and practical for them to be investigated here and for the perpetrator to be sentenced here in Ukraine. So it's not, I agree, it's not really the same case as it was in Syria. Thank you.
Thanks. Next question, which I'm going to bring back Ariana on. Can there be a legal case for the crime of genocide against Russia, genocide by Russia in Ukraine? Ariana.
Yes, there can be, but if you don't mind, I'd actually like to answer a different question first to contrast the two answers. I think it's very important. And I'd like to speak to how to better bring justice to Ukrainians first, and answer the genocide question second. In 2019, and again in the week immediately following Russia's large-scale military offensive of February 2022, Ukrainian international law expert Roman Son and I co-authored articles urging the international community to join efforts to establish a special United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. It was clear to us that without a proper authoritative international tribunal, Putin and his criminal cabal will never face justice. And since then, many prominent lawyers, politicians, and public figures have called for the establishment of a special international tribunal to send a strong message to Russian leadership and to Russian society that their illegal war against Ukraine will not go unpunished. But here we are, 10 years into Russia's genocidal war of extermination of the Ukrainian nation and people, and we still need to advocate for this cause. Instead of making the inevitability of prosecution of the Russian regime a cornerstone of the international response to Russian aggression, the international community is dragging its feet on the issue. All the while, Ukrainians are told to have patience for the slow pace of international justice, and other alternative proposals are being made. Sadly, one of the main reasons we haven't seen enough progress on establishing a special international tribunal is the same reason Ukraine is not getting the weapons it needs to repress Russian aggression. The West calls it caution. But in reality, it's a lack of political will to confront Russia and delusions about reaching some political settlement at the expense of Ukrainian interests. The tragic reality is that the legal prosecution of Russian leadership in an international tribunal is considered one of the bargaining chips for negotiating an off-ramp for Putin. The immorality of this position aside, it's a very dangerous and harmful gamble. If no justice will be done in an international tribunal, Russian lies about their genocidal war against Ukraine will forever replace the truth. Ukrainians have sacrificed so very, very much and so many lives, and we shouldn't force them to sacrifice the truth as well. And this is why I would like to see the international community and legal experts working towards establishing a UN-mandated special international tribunal for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Such a tribunal should also have as its mission to repair the faults of the cowardly and corrupt politics that helped Russia deceive the world about its war of aggression against Ukraine for 8 years. It should have a clear mandate to investigate the evidence related to Russian aggression back to 2014. It would be a grave injustice to Ukrainians and to international law to ignore the first 8 years of the very same genocidal war Russia is waging today. I don't believe we should be distracted by other options like prosecuting Russian leadership in an internationalized national tribunal in Ukraine or elsewhere. Such a hybrid tribunal offers a great deal less international legitimacy. We shouldn't settle for less, especially when it comes to a crime of such magnitude for the international community, because let's be clear about this, Russia's aggression is designed to obliterate the whole post-World War II international legal order. We must also bear in mind that the victim is not supposed to be the prosecutor. Ukrainians can tell their story, but it is the duty of the international community to prosecute Russian actions as international crimes and bring the perpetrators in the Kremlin to justice. In the past years, to keep Western support, Kyiv has had to make some legal decisions which compromised Ukraine's national interests. They were dictated by Western political strategy to achieve a peaceful settlement with Russia through German and French mediation in the infamous Minsk process. I would hate to see something like this repeated again, with Ukrainians forced to accept some abridged form of justice because of the unwillingness of the international community to prosecute the fascist Russian regime. It must be clear to everyone that a just and lasting peace in Ukraine depends on the world recognizing the truth of Russian crimes. Denying Ukrainians justice or postponing it further will only encourage Russia to stay its aggressive course.
Right. And I'm going to go to Ibrahim now for the question of the crime of genocide. Ibrahim.
I guess to answer that question, one would need to know whether the law is fit for purpose, right? So when we say, are we able to kind of prosecute genocide, it means, are we able to use the existing law as was created by other conflicts in order to do that? And I guess here there's big reluctance from the legal community that interpret the black letter law, are not looking at bigger pictures, but interpret the black letter law in order to see whether they should be able to kind of prosecute genocide or not. They see that the current law does not easily lend itself to be able to do so. That doesn't mean that per different definitions and per social elements of the word that a genocide is not happening. So here is a matter of I think there are two distinct issues. One is where would such a prosecution take place, and I think other than an international court, the intended strategic impact of prosecuting genocide, I'm afraid, might be affected if one country decides to do that on itself or by itself. And I would say, my personal opinion is that it's not the ideal situation in a situation like that, just because it takes away from the gravity that genocide should concern the entire international community and not just taken forward by one country. And the current kind of international court system, as per different people that kind of interpret it, they don't see it lending itself very easily to prosecuting genocide. Does that mean that one should not try to make arguments for that? Absolutely not. I think people should try and should make the argument because law develops, and law develops because of exact situations like in the one in Ukraine. People often, call out the law for not being created, and must remember that these are man-made laws. They can be amended and they can develop. And it's situations like this where they get called out. But in order to call something out, we must understand the limits of it, and we must be absolutely well versed in it in order for our criticism not to be dismissed as non-technical or political. Now, the second question that comes to mind when thinking about prosecuting genocide is the kind of intended punishment of that by the very nature of where we are from a criminology perspective. There isn't anything much that you can give beyond a death sentence or a life imprisonment, whether it's a war crime or a crime against humanity or a genocide. And genocide and crimes against humanity are much harder to prove in that sense. So the question then becomes, are you going for the quicker, speedier, gets you the same sentence, or are you going for the more strategic, important for narrative, important for history, might not be as quick and might not be as successful kind of case? And I think that's something, first and foremost for the Ukrainians and those who work on the file to decide, with opinions and advice from people around them. But we must remember that the punishment in a very kind of penal sense for genocide will probably not be much more than what it is for crimes against humanity or war crimes.
Thank you. Andre?
When we are talking about the crime of genocide, especially in Ukrainian context, as a lawyer, I'm very skeptical about the perspectives of proving it in general context, because crime of genocide has one element, the intent to destroy the particular ethnic, religious, or racial group. And in the context of Russian actions against Ukraine, it would be very hard to establish this particular intent. Yeah, the military purpose, the military advantage, yeah, but it's an element of the war crime, but not of the crime of genocide. But except of one particular case, the case of deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia and to the occupied territories of Ukraine. If we turn to the Rome Statute and its definition of genocide, Article 6, it provides that deportation of children of one group to another group is particularly a crime of genocide. And all the actions of Russian authorities and of Russian militaries regarding the deportation of children, they are very likely to comply with all these requirements, because this is not only the evacuation of children, it's not only their placement from one territory to another. The Russian authorities made a lot of consecutive actions that show that they not just want to replace children, they just want to make Ukrainian children Russian children. They want to assimilate them with the Russian environment. They facilitated their legislation for the children to get the Russian citizenship. They imposed them into a Russian cultural environment aimed to destroy their Ukrainian identity. They are changing their educational curricula. They are threatening parents and even Ukrainian teenagers on the occupied territories that in case they don't visit pro-Russian schools, they shall be adopted forcibly by Russian families and then transferred to the very, very far regions of Russian Federation. And in complex, this all, to my opinion, of course, I'm not a prosecutor and I'm not a judge. I cannot make any final indictment or judgment. But for me, this definitely looks as a genocidal case. Of course, the Russian authorities do not have a purpose to physically destroy Ukrainian children as a group, but they particularly aim to destroy their Ukrainian identity, to destroy them as Ukrainians and then in future use them as their Russian force against Ukraine. So for me, this may be a genocide, 100%. Thank you.
Stephen?
Yes, I think two prior speakers, I think, have pointed to the challenges here. You know, as someone who deals globally with many groups of victims and survivors, almost everyone who's experienced these horrible atrocities say we're the subject of genocide. And we have the challenge that in international courts, it's been very hard to prove that because of this requirement that you have to have the intent to destroy a whole people in whole or it's part, but that's been construed by courts as substantial part. And so proving that intent has been the hard part. And so we have in these situations, like in Myanmar with the Rohingya, in China, in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, in Darfur with the various ethnicities that are there, situations where people have said it's genocide, but then the courts have often said not. And we even in Bosnia had the situation where they did determine that the killing of the Muslim men and boys at Srebrenica was a genocide because it happened in that area and basically eliminated that population in the area. The courts were unwilling to say that any of the other crimes against Bosnian Muslims conducted in a systematic way, frankly, constituted genocide. So we often have that challenge. I appreciate Andrei's point on the deportation of children, because this is an interesting aspect of the law. You know, the genocide word was coined by Raphael Lemkin, who was a student in Lviv. Then it was between the wars, it was Polish territory, Lvov, and he gets credit for being Polish. I don't know which he is, but he invented this term genocide, and he envisioned that sort of cultural genocide would count as genocide. But when they went to drafting the treaty in New York, that was rejected. Until just before it was approved, it was actually the Greek delegation that said, what about the deportation of children? Because they had actually experienced Greek children being deported into Bulgaria after the Civil War, and they said, we need to deal with that. So they added that part from Lemkin's on cultural destruction and brought it over into an act of genocide. All the others require a physical or biological destruction. That one really, it talks about this, the child is still living, but he's moved from one group to the next, and of course, grows up in that group and presumably has children in that group, and if you moved enough children, you would destroy that original ethnic group. And so it is interesting that this is one of the ways in which you can commit genocide. Now, it's the acts. There are 5 different ways. This is the 5th way. You can commit genocide, but then you have to combine it with the intent. And you can prove that this was done with the intent to destroy Ukrainian nationality in whole or significant part. And I think there is the potential of showing that. Now, do keep in mind that, you know, you do have, particularly those, you know, people that have, you know, I mean, I've mentioned this case of Armin Gasparian this morning in his book that really calls for the denazification of Ukraine, which means eliminating Ukrainian nationality, et cetera. And when you see that kind of intent and when you can see that kind of rhetoric in the mouths of the people involved in the deportation of children, then I think you have the potential to prosecute genocide. And you also have the potential, I mean, I prosecuted the Rwandan media on the grounds of a certain incitement to genocide. Though that incitement led to a genocide, you can prosecute an incitement that doesn't lead to a genocide if the person intends it. And so there's the potential, I think, to prosecute, if not genocide, then incitement from some of these people that have used this extreme rhetoric and pursue that. And I would hope that there would be courts that would take this on. Even in the universal jurisdiction context, I noticed the Germans have recently got a genocide conviction in Frankfurt against an ISIS fighter, originally an Iraqi, but someone that they brought out who was traveling in Greece, and they brought him to Frankfurt and tried him because he was involved in killing a Yazidi sex slave's little girl by putting her out in the 50-degree heat. And he, of course, had this whole Yazidi attitude or this whole ISIS attitude that Yazidis are infidels and they need to be destroyed, etc. There's no hope. They either convert or die. And so he had the intent, and he killed a little girl. Conviction, genocide. So sometimes it is possible to put these cases together and get that conviction. And I think it's very meaningful for victims when you do that. even though there are other crimes, like crimes against humanity, persecution, that may be easier to prove and can carry the same sentence. Obviously, as a lawyer, I always believed that when I was prosecuting in Sierra Leone, because I prosecuted mutilation as a war crime, mutilation as a crime against humanity, rape as both, sexual slavery, forced marriage, I thought it was important to recognize all of the things that have been done to the victims. And if you've got a solid case on several things, by all means, go for it. But also, it's important to develop the law and to say to the victims, what happened to you was the crime of crimes. And so I'm entirely sympathetic with efforts to do this. We need to find the right case and the right suspect.
Thank you. Yevgeny.
Sure. So I have very little to add to my colleagues who've covered a lot of ground here. I will just point out maybe two things. That the child deportation case is probably the strongest case to make of genocide. But that genocide, I mean, I think there is the number of victims is obviously just an indicator of a genocide, as the ambassador just demonstrated, that you have to meet the elements and to meet that. But I think if you contrast what is happening in Ukraine, and there are crimes against humanity, I think undoubtedly war crimes, crimes of aggression, to me, my personal opinion is that if the Russians could come in and get the Ukrainians to give up and become Russian, they would not kill Ukrainians in general. They would kill certain Ukrainians, but not overall, because they ultimately want to absorb the resources of Ukraine, which is the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian natural resources. You contrast that to what looks like to me an obvious case of genocide, and on a kind of more localized scale, but what happened in Israel. You know, when men, women, children, dogs, everything was killed, that strikes sort of a mental picture in your mind of what a genocide looks like. And you, other than the deportations of children, you don't see, in some localized scenarios, you don't see that kind of Russian behavior.
Right. Next question, and back to Ariana now. Let's imagine that somehow Putin leaves the Kremlin and the job of Russian president alive. What would be the chances of Putin being put to justice, and how would that look? What would have to happen? Ariana.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm sure this is very frustrating for you, but I'm actually going to answer the genocide question now, and that'll be it for me.
We'll put you on trial.
Yeah,
I'm joking.
No, I'm going to answer the genocide question. As I said, I wanted to defer it because I wanted to contrast it with the previous point that I made in the last answer. While there's no consensus that Russia is waging a war of aggression against Ukraine, we see a lack of unity regarding the legal forum for trying Russian leadership for this crime. With Russia's genocide of Ukrainians, we see the reverse. There is no question of legal jurisdiction. The International Criminal Court can try Russian citizens for the crime of genocide, but there's no consensus on whether Russia is in fact committing genocide in Ukraine. Many people don't perceive Russian criminal actions in Ukraine since 2014 as genocide, because when they see Ukrainians defending themselves and surviving, it looks very different from how people imagine genocide. The majority thinks about genocide as a brutal slaughter of helpless innocent victims. But genocide is about the intent, as people have spoken, to destroy the group as such. The group can cease to exist not only as a result of physical extermination, but also when its identity perishes. While there's a rather widespread understanding that many atrocities committed by Russians in Ukraine fall into the 5 categories of actions which qualify as acts of genocide, though not unanimous understanding, the biggest controversy remains about whether we can attribute intent to the Russian state. And when you listen to some lawyers or politicians, it feels like the only persuasive evidence for them to accept the fact of genocide would be if Putin made an official statement saying something like this, perhaps even these exact words: "My fellow citizens, the objective of the Russian state is to exterminate Ukrainians as a group, and this is why I've signed a decree ordering all of you to kill all living Ukrainians everywhere in the world and laying out a plan of how we shall all proceed." And I feel like it's by their logic that nothing less than that would satisfy the criteria of intent. But intent can be attributed to Russia not just through evidence of paperwork and government decisions documenting the genocide policy and its execution plan. Intent can be inferred from incitement to genocide in public statements and state propaganda, as well as from the systematic pattern of atrocities that are perpetrated. Russia's intent to commit genocide didn't start in Bucha or in Irpin. Those massacres were the outcome of genocidal conditioning by the Russian state of its citizens. Russia is a totalitarian society, and for 2 decades, the Russian state has directed its propaganda to whip up anti-Ukrainian sentiment, to dehumanize and to vilify Ukrainians. Russia has long been investing enormous resources to cultivate hatred for Ukrainians, to deny the existence of the Ukrainian identity, and to brainwash its citizens to perceive Ukrainians as villains, criminals, thieves, Nazis, moral deviants, not worthy of existence. From the time of Ukraine's 2013 Euromaidan protest, Russian propaganda promoted the destruction of Ukraine as an implied mission of the Russian state. Russians were being prepared to exterminate Ukrainians because it is something that is expected of them by Russia and for Russia. The destruction of the Ukrainian nation has been the essence of Russia's aggression since its invasion in February 2014. Russia's stated Novorossiya plan was designed to destroy Ukraine as a nation. The plan failed, but the design remained. Between 2014 and 2022, Russia managed to wipe out all traces of Ukrainian identity in Russia-occupied Ukraine through a massive violent campaign of killings, torture, intimidation, and destruction. Russians destroyed Ukrainian books in schools and libraries, monuments, streets, names, and other objects of cultural heritage. And I'd like to remind the audience that it was in 2014 and not in 2022 that Ukraine filed its first submission with the European Court of Human Rights against Russia regarding the forced deportation of Ukrainian children to Russian territory. The pattern of Russian genocidal crimes has not changed since 2014, only the scale has. In 2022, Putin himself incited genocide by proclaiming that the objective of Russia's military attack on Ukraine was to denazify it. Anyone analyzing Russian state propaganda must agree that Putin's statement must be interpreted as a call for eliminating anyone with the Ukrainian identity. From 2022, Russian media started using explicit rhetoric about exterminating Ukrainians, and we have seen this genocidal rhetoric translated into action on a large scale.
Right.
The intercepted calls of Russian soldiers show that they and their families have deeply internalized the genocidal narrative. And there's a massive amount of evidence on the ground that while the Russian military has been specifically targeting everyone who they perceive as a carrier of the Ukrainian identity. Former soldiers who fought in Donbass prior to 2022, volunteers, family members of soldiers, civilians who publicly expressed support for free Ukraine or for Maidan, civilians with tattoos of the Trezub, the Ukrainian coat of arms, flags, civilians speaking Ukrainian, Ukrainians who were in possession of Russian banned pro-Ukrainian literature or pictures, and so on. So in my opinion, from the point of view of law, there is no doubt that Russia is committing deliberate, organized, systemic, and conscious actions directed by the state to exterminate Ukrainians as a group with a shared national identity. And Moscow clearly perceives this as the means of destroying the Ukrainian sovereign state.
Thank you. You make a very strong argument.
It's important for me to just finish this last statement. I don't feel that lawyers should be playing cowardly politics, but have the integrity to follow facts to see justice done. And the crime of genocide is an attack on humanity. And I hope that the International Criminal Court will be building a solid case to expose Russian genocide.
Now, briefly, Ariana, please, what do you think about this question that I just asked about potentially putting Putin himself on trial? Briefly, please.
I think it's possible. One would have, actually my answer can't be brief, unfortunately. So I don't feel that time permits me to answer it properly, because I see this as part of a combined legal and political strategy of defeating Russia. I believe that Russia, one of the West's main political objectives should be the military and political defeat of the Russian Federation, and that would ultimately include occupying Russia, like the Allies occupied Germany after World War II. And then, unless Putin kills himself, you can put him on trial.
That was brief. Thank you.
Yeah, I have comments on the last question. Personally, I'm very skeptical about the perspectives of Putin be put physically at trial and live in International Criminal Court or in the special tribunal on aggression. Of course, it's possible, theoretically possible, but we must understand that Russia is a very powerful enemy, and the war may last for a lot of years, and that it may not finish the obvious way of Russian total military defeat and physical capture of Putin. So that's why there should be considered the mechanism of persecuting Putin's aggression and other leaders of the Troika, of first three higher executives of Russia in absentia. And this is the argument for in the discussion for establishing the specialized tribunal, that it should be hybrid and should act based on national legislation, because as it was mentioned, for instance, French legislation and Ukrainian legislation, by the way, allow to investigate and judge a person in absentia, while the Rome Statute and based on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the right of a person to stand physically before the trial doesn't allow for this. But to my opinion, the right of a person to stand physically before the international trial should not be interpreted in such an absolute way. For instance, there are precedents in the Rome Statute specifically. The charges against a person may be adopted and may be approved without his or her presence, and only a subsequent court investigation is conducted only in his or her presence. Moreover, in European Court of Human Rights, the court hearings may be provided without the presence of the person, because actually it's logical, because in majority of cases this person is already imprisoned. I think there should be a political will, and there should be a real dose of legal argumentation. But in my opinion, it's really possible to elaborate the mechanism of judging Putin in absentia, because it's really important to have this sentence, and it's really important also to enforce some material liability, for instance, for freezing assets and for compensating the damages for victims from these assets, because we don't know whether there shall be a real possibility to imprison them, to arrest them and put them before the trial, or even they may be dead before this mere possibility.
Thank you. Stephen, briefly.
I mean, I think it's very important that Putin's been charged. I'd like to see him charged with crimes other than deportation of children, as important as that crime is. I mean, obviously, the intentional targeting of the civilian population and infrastructure, I mean, explicitly saying, you know, taking action last October, and I'm sure it'll be happening now soon, to freeze people over the course of the winter, nothing to do with military advantage, it's all about essentially attacking the civilian population. He should be charged with that crime as well. And of course, I support that the court of aggression, an international court that would have the power to charge a chief of state, which a national court cannot do. Difficult, enormously difficult to bring Putin to justice. But I do remember it was difficult to bring Milosevic to justice, or Charles Taylor to justice. They were both charged by international courts while they were still in office. Nobody thought they would ever be brought to trial. Milosevic was charged in May '99. Within 15 months, he was pushed out as leader of Serbia. I mean, he lost an election, tried to steal it, was forced by demonstrations in the street to give up power to a fellow nationalist, but not a war criminal, Kostunica. And within 9 months, because of international pressure and conditionality, and because evidence was so strong of his corruption and the way he'd been stealing money from the people of Serbia, he was sent to The Hague. And of course, he wasn't a nuclear power leader, and different, but the same with Taylor. He went into exile, and eventually the pressure built, and the U.S. said to the head of Nigeria, well, I won't meet with you unless you arrest him and send him to the court. And so we can eventually do it if we keep focused on it, I think. But even then, having this arrest warrant hanging over his head is extremely important. We've seen it in the way that he couldn't go to South Africa. Brazil said, well, maybe you can come to BRICS next year. Well, their legal advisor said, no, we'd have to arrest you. Suddenly, he's not what he was beforehand. And so he's either going to die in prison, having been charged and convicted, or he's going to die as an international pariah, one or the other. And so that's why it's so important, I think, that people at the highest level be charged.
Right. Evgeny, please, briefly.
Sure. So first, I'd like to reinforce the point Ariana made, just in less than 1 minute. The Ukrainians' ability to defend themselves has certainly impacted how we visualize the situation here. So I think had Ukraine been occupied completely, the situation may be different. And so these are indicators, these are more factual questions rather than indicators of intent, which is a critical component. But Ukrainian defense has played a critical role in preventing a much worse situation. As to Putin, I think I'm a little bit more optimistic. Russia is not as stable as it once seemed. I mean, 3 months ago, Prigozhin's army was, within, 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers of Moscow. So the most important thing is to gather the evidence, build cases for the potential eventual arrest and trial of Putin. And that could happen as a result of instability in Russia. If the government falls and there's a desire to return to the community of nations, Putin can be given up. So I think anything really is possible, and it's just about preparing to try Putin and hold him accountable.
Thank you. And Ibrahim, I really apologize, but I can't give you the word because I'm getting into serious trouble here. And before we end it, Farzaneh Husseini here has been very patient with us, and we are grateful. And she's going to give a statement about the situation in Iran. As she said earlier, Iran is a key ally of Russia, and she mentioned how Iran is involved in Syria as well. So please.
Yes, so it's hard to know where to start. I think I mentioned briefly the challenges that we're facing as Iranians within Iran. I think if you watch the news, it's very clear to people the oppression and the abuses of human rights that are taking place within the country, which the United Nations has condemned 72 times with 0 repercussions for the regime. I think something that is common in all of this is that the fight to bring about accountability and justice very much relies on the willingness of the international community to take the crimes of these dictators seriously and to take action and to stop the policy of what we have in Iran, a policy of appeasement, which is governments basically acting in their short-term interests, either economic interests or giving into hostage diplomacy, which has become a phenomenon in Iran at the moment, in connection with which President Biden just authorized the release of $6 billion to Iran, which is now making its way to Hamas in Gaza and across the region. So we as Iranians have been facing these issues and the lack of the the lack of will on the part of the international community to actually assist us Iranians in attaining democracy in our own country, as well as holding them to account for acts of terrorism in the Middle East, but also in Europe. I think something that the ambassador touched on briefly was a good step which did happen a couple of years ago. Sweden exercised its discretion essentially under the rule of universal jurisdiction to prosecute one of the main, I wouldn't say one of the main perpetrators of the 1988 massacre, but one of the people that was involved in this massacre, an executioner during the 1988 massacre, during which 30,000 political prisoners, mostly members of the PMOI, the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, were executed, which included children, pregnant women, grandmothers, grandfathers, including members of my own family, which I won't delve into too much. And Hamid Nouri was a prison guard during the massacre which took place at Gohardash prison. It also took place in Evin prison. So the bodies were, these people were executed, the bodies were disinfected, piled up and buried in mass graves. This man, Hamid Nouri, traveled to Sweden, and Sweden arrested him on his arrival at Arlanda airport, and he was imprisoned while they were preparing a case against him. Sweden had absolutely no connection to the massacre. It didn't have any citizens that were executed by the regime. It had no connection whatsoever, but it was willing to prosecute this man for crimes that were committed 35 years ago. So this was a milestone for us as relatives of the victims of the massacre and the killings which have taken place. It shows us that where states are willing to take action, that perpetrators of grave crimes can be convicted and can face justice. Unfortunately, again, it relies on the will of the international community. I'm hoping that now they're starting to wake up a little bit more. We know that the United States declared a red line when, in terms of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Bashar al-Assad went ahead, used the chemical weapons against his own people with no repercussions. Again, with the invasion, the annexation of Crimea, we didn't see any meaningful action on the part of the international community, which is why we're here today. So it's so important for us to stand together. I think we are suffering from the same enemy or ally of enemies, and I think it's really important to learn from each other and stand together and support each other where we can to try to bring accountability and put pressure on the international community to facilitate that.
Thank you, and thanks to the audience and to the guests. And to conclude, moderately optimistic and highly depressing at the same time. Have a good afternoon, everyone.